This is the story of the greatest deal in aviation history. To run an airline, you gotta be a special kind of brilliant.
Sometimes it's hard to be.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
Bye-bye, baby, baby, goodbye. Everybody was kung fu fighting.
It's 1975 and Frank Borman is the boss of Eastern Airlines.
I'm Frank Borman, the president of Eastern.
In its heyday, Eastern had been the most profitable airline in the world, but from the 1960s onwards, it had been in a near constant state of crisis. Frank has a mountain of problems.
A lot of people will tell you that Eastern Airlines isn't perfect. And you know what? They're right.
To start with, Eastern's fleet is old, 75 aging Boeing 727s and 66 Lockheed TriStars. Lovely planes, but noisy, cramped, fuel-guzzling dinosaurs. They're unreliable, expensive to maintain. The Boeing 727 has a rather worrying tendency to crash. Frank's second problem is cutthroat competition. It's forcing him to cut prices. Eastern have a massive hub in Atlanta. That's put them in direct competition with Delta. Both companies are locked into a price war, slashing ticket prices. Both companies are suffering. On top of all that, Eastern is heavily in debt. It owes close on $900 million, around $8 billion today. The problems didn't end there though. Inflation was high, wages were increasing, industrial action was a constant threat. Frank's other headache was that the airline industry itself was facing deregulation and pressure from government to reduce ticket prices. On his first day as the boss, Frank Borman sat in his office at the Rockefeller Center in New York. Back then, it was called the Eastern Airlines building. On the back of an envelope, Frank did the math. If he could fly his entire fleet at 110% capacity, then the company would break even. But only if jet fuel prices didn't go up. Fat chance.
In the Dallas area today, dealers raised prices to more than 40 cents a gallon.
Remember, this is 1975. The first oil crisis was in 1973. That crisis had doubled the price of jet fuel and it was still climbing. By 1980, the price would be 10 times higher. It was looking dire. Frank, though, was about to do the greatest deal in aviation history. Frank Borman was extraordinary. He was made of the right stuff. No pun intended. Frank was a high flyer from the get-go. Frank grew up in Tucson, Arizona. He had a ride in an airplane at the age of 5 and fell in love with flying. He got his pilot's license at just 15. He joined the Air Force, became a fighter pilot. He got his master's at Caltech. He was the professor of thermodynamics and fluid mechanics at West Point. He was a colonel in the US Air Force. He was a test pilot at Edwards Air Force Base. Oh, and Frank was an astronaut.
Ignition sequence start. Engines armed. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All engines running. Launch commit. Liftoff. We have liftoff. The tower is clear.
He joined NASA and was the commander of Gemini 7 and Apollo 8. He flew to the moon and back, literally.
3 explorers, named Borman, Lovell, and Anders, whose names are going down in the history books as surely as did Magellan, Vasco da Gama, and Columbus.
Only 24 people have been to the moon, only 12 have stood on it. NASA wanted Frank to be the first. NASA asked him, begged him really, to command Apollo 11. He was the best of the best, and NASA wanted Frank to be the first man to walk on the moon, but Frank turned it down because been there, done that. Really, in Frank's mind, he'd been to the moon once. Why would he want to go back? Instead, he watched the moon landings with the president at the White House. In 1970, he left NASA and joined Eastern. It wasn't for the money, it was for the challenge. He was that kind of guy. By 1975, he was the CEO. Only a year later, he was chairman of the board. No one else would take the job. The company was nosediving into bankruptcy. Everyone knew it, but Frank had a cunning plan. For the next part of our story, we have to leave America and fly across the Atlantic. The quickest way to do that is by Concorde, an extraordinary plane, built jointly, of course, by British Airways and Air France. It was a technological marvel. Concorde was very much a British idea, designed very much to safeguard British jobs. You see, in 1965, the British government commissioned the Plowden Report. British planes weren't selling. The government wanted to do something about it. British jobs were on the line. Lord Plowden looked at the industry and noted the market was dominated by two huge US companies, Boeing and McDonnell Douglas. Those two firms controlled 80% of the global market. Lord Plowden's conclusion was the aircraft industry, both in Britain and in Europe, was too fractured to compete with the Americans. Too many small companies, Hawker Siddeley, Shorts, BAC, the list goes on. If something wasn't done, and soon, they'd all be out of business with thousands on the dole. Lord Plowden recommended something revolutionary: multinational collaboration. Britain led the way, building the Concorde with France and the Tornado with the Germans and Italians. Everyone loved Concorde. The only downside was that nobody wanted to buy it. 20 Concordes were built, none were ever sold. But the Tornadoes did sell. Not well, but the Saudis bought a bunch of them. Airbus was formed as a direct result of the Plowden Report. The French wanted to stop American influence. The Germans wanted to revive its aircraft industry. The Brits saw a prestige global trading opportunity. It was a collaboration. The French would build the cockpit and control systems. The Germans, the fuselage. The Brits would build the wings. Every country playing to its engineering strengths, concentrating its efforts. It was genius. In business terms, you might call it industry consolidation. In political terms, Europe was taking on the Yanks. Huge cost, massive risk, big gamble. The first Airbus A300 flew out of the factory in 1972. It was an extraordinary plane, the world's first twin-engine, wide-bodied airliner.
Well, I think it's a very big improvement. You know that the wide-body concept is more comfort for passenger.
Wide enough that you could fit two containers in it, side by side, and still have seats for 250 passengers. It was fast too, 518 miles per hour. Those British wings gave it huge lift. It was light too. The tail was made from fiberglass reinforced plastic. It was the first plane to ever have parts made from composite materials. That combination of speed, lift and light weight meant it could climb quickly to its cruising altitude. That saved fuel. This was an economic aeroplane. The fuselage design was so clever it's still in use today. Airbus was smart. The engines were two American off-the-shelf General Electric units. That saved money and helped sell the plane in America. Not only that, but the designs and manuals, even the flight deck instruments, were all in feet and inches. That too would make it easier to compete in America. Airbus knew this was a great aeroplane. They embarked on a huge sales campaign. They took an A300 and stuffed it full of French champagne, engineers and Europe's best salesmen, and then they took it on a whirlwind tour of America. It was a sensation. Everybody who saw it loved it. Everybody who read about it in the acres of publicity wondered at the marvel of the age. It was unquestionably the best aeroplane on the market. 4 years later, and they had total sales of 0. Not one was sold. No one was buying. Airbus was instantly an industry joke. The very definition of a white elephant. Sure, they flogged a few to Lufthansa and Air France, but they were national flag carriers who had to buy 3 each under the terms of the Airbus deal the French and the Germans had signed to set up the joint venture. Neither Lufthansa nor Air France took an option to buy any extras. If the French, Germans and British weren't buying their own plane, then why would anybody else? You see, Airbus had a problem. Airlines won't buy an unproven airplane from a brand new company with no track record. The A300 was too big, twice as many seats as the Boeing 727. The A300 was brimming with tech, but in 1975 that sounded like it was bound to break down. It only had 2 engines at a time when American regulations stipulated you needed 3 to cross the Atlantic. But worst of all, it wasn't American, it wasn't Italian, it wasn't British, not really, it wasn't really from anywhere. It was unpatriotic to buy it. Frank Borman saw the plane on its American tour. He liked what he'd seen and he had an idea. Frank called Airbus and offered them a deal. The deal was insane. Airbus wasn't selling planes, but it was still making them. Airbus feared if it stopped making planes, it would be shut down. Unsold white-tail planes were parked up in Toulouse. Aeroplanes are big. Toulouse was running out of space. Frank said he was going to do Airbus a favour. He would take 4 white-tail planes off their hands. Now, taking a plane no one wants is odd, but what makes this one of the greatest deals in the history of aviation is that Frank negotiated a price of 0, nothing. Frank wanted Airbus to give his heavily indebted, failing US airline 4 brand new airplanes for free. Airbus, incredibly, said yes. Airbus was hemorrhaging money. No one was buying anyway. This was a chance. Frank was offering a glimmer of hope. It was a mad gamble. It was a long shot. It worked like a charm. Frank took quick delivery and put the planes to work immediately. The A300 turned out to be better than anything Eastern had. It was better than anything any airline in the world had. Pan Am, TWA and crucially Delta looked on in awe. The A300s were faster, wider, quieter and more comfortable. Frank was delighted when he discovered his A300s were reliable, very reliable. They needed less maintenance. The turnaround times were quicker. Crucially, they used 30% less fuel than even his TriStars. Eastern hadn't turned a profit since 1969, yet now, with Frank Borman's A300s, the company was headed back into profit. After only 3 months, Frank doubled down on his industry advantage. He placed an order for 34 planes. It was the biggest order for planes in the history of aviation. But what makes this the sweetest deal in the history of aviation was the small print. Frank negotiated an extraordinary deal for Eastern. You see, for Frank, the Airbus A300 had 2 drawbacks. The first was minor. The restroom light said toilet instead of lavatory. Second was harder to fix. The A300 had 260 seats. Too many. Each A300 had a list price of $17.5 million. In today's money, around $160 million. Too much. Frank struck a bargain. Frank bought the planes, but he only paid Airbus for 170 seats. A 35% discount. Under the deal, if he sold tickets to the public for the other 80 seats, he would pay Airbus, but if not, he wouldn't pay them a dime. And it didn't stop there. Frank was smart. He secured loan guarantees from the Germans and the French. In effect, he used Airbus's own money to buy Airbuses at a massive discount. Even so, the deal was big. $1.4 billion, around $90 billion in today's money. Frank was immediately criticised for not buying American planes, but he loudly declared that he would happily buy any American plane, but only if it was as good as the A300. The head of McDonnell Douglas called him unpatriotic to his face. Frank replied, "What car are you driving? It sure don't look American to me." But the engines on his A300s were American. He argued the A300 was as American as apple pie, just with a little chic European styling.
The A300 is our biggest new investment. It's quiet, fuel efficient, spacious. But if our crew doesn't make you feel comfortable, it won't matter what plane you're flying. I fly Eastern, but you don't have to. So we have to earn our wings every day.
This then is the greatest deal in aviation history because every airline in the world sat up and took notice. Eastern was making money. Everyone had to get in on the act. The orders came flying in. Airbus sold planes across America and Asia too. They couldn't keep up with the demand. Eastern was saved by Frank Borman. By 1985, Eastern was carrying more passengers than any other airline in the world.
Maybe that's why for the second year in a row, we've sold almost 2 million more seats than the year before. If we want you to buy a seat on Eastern all the time, we have to earn our wings every day.
Airbus was saved by the Astronaut. Airbus has since gone from strength to strength. Donald Douglas has long gone. Right now, Airbus is selling more planes than Boeing. By working together, Europe took on America and won.